Hey class, today we're going to learn about photosynthesis. Does anyone know what photosynthesis is?
Blah, 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 blah.
Photosynthesis is the breakdown of sunlight to produce plant energy. Photosynthesis is an endergonic reaction, which means that energy is required to produce the reaction, and the change in energy in the reaction is positive. Photosynthesis is a series of reactions, which are the light-dependent reactions and the Calvin cycle reactions. The light-dependent reaction will produce oxygen from water, and the Calvin cycle will produce sugar from carbon dioxide.
Photosynthesis begins with the light-dependent reaction. In this reaction, the light enters the plant cell, as with carbon dioxide and water. The water is broken down into hydrogen ions and oxygen. The hydrogen is oxidized, forming an ion, and its electrons are formed to continue the flow of photosynthesis. Also, before proceeding into the cell membrane, light is broken down into photons through its electromagnetic form of energy.
Since the photons are on the electromagnetic spectrum, each photon has a specific wavelength that contains a certain amount of energy which helps travel through the cell. There are two major classes of pigment, the chlorophyll and the carotenoids. Each of these pigments have a specific absorption spectra which refers to what wavelengths they absorb. These pigments work together. The carotenoids absorb light and pass the energy to the chlorophyll. There are two types of chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. They share the same structure as they both consist of a head and tail. The head is the part that absorbs the light, while the tail keeps it embedded to the thylakoid membrane.
Photosystems are the complexes that contain both types of chlorophyll. They are the location of light absorption. The electrons from the water enter photosystem 2. Then, the light hits the chlorophyll head, providing energy to excite the electrons. The electrons will then run through the electron transport chain. This causes the pumping of hydrogen ions into the thylakoid compartment, creating a proton gradient.
Within the chlorophyll, red and blue photons are utilized to raise electrons to state 1 and 2. The light-dependent reaction is there to allow the conversion of light energy into chemical energy. The light-dependent reaction first absorbs the energy from the sun, then once the water is broken down, the hydrogen ions are transported across the thylakoid membrane. This process goes through 2 cycles. The second time the energy is absorbed, NADPH is produced from NADP+, and the hydrogen ions then diffuse through the protein channel, finally allowing ADP to become ATP.
That was all for the light-dependent reactions. So now we move on to the second part of photosynthesis, the Calvin cycle. This cycle is considered a light-independent reaction because it does not directly require sunlight in order to react.
The Calvin cycle produces sugar from carbon dioxide using ATP and NADPH that are produced from the light-dependent reactions we talked about before.
The first phase in the Calvin cycle is carbon fixation. This refers to the attachment of carbon dioxide to an organic compound. During carbon fixation, carbon dioxide binds to the ribulose biphosphate, or RUBP. Carbon dioxide contains 1 carbon, while RUBP contains 5 carbons. When they bind, it produces a 6-carbon chain with a phosphate group at each end.
This 6-carbon chain splits into 2 3-carbon chains, each with a phosphate group at its end. What process is this similar to in cellular respiration?
Glycolysis.
Correct! It is similar to the formation of pyruvate through the process of glycolysis.
These 3-carbon chains, called 3-phosphoglycerate, continue to the next phase of the Calvin cycle, reduction.
Reduction, the addition of electrons of 3-phosphoglycerate, is possible because of the ATP and NADPH that was formed during the light-dependent reactions. Some of the reduced 3-phosphoglycerate molecules form glucose, while some are used to form RUBP. The formation of RUBP is used again during carbon fixation, continuing the cycle.
The Calvin cycle described is the standard pathway for a C3 plant. It is called a C3 plant because it produces 3 carbon chains. Some examples of plants that have C3 pathways are wheat, soy, and rice.
The C3 pathway is not the only way to undergo the Calvin cycle. Several plants have undergone adaptations to allow for a more efficient production of sugar.
One of the other pathways is called the C4 pathway. Can one of you guess why it is called the C4 pathway instead of the C3 pathway?
It has a 4-carbon chain instead of a 3-carbon chain.
Correct. So during carbon fixation, instead of CO2 attaching to RUBP, it will attach to something called PEP carboxylase. PEP carboxylase has 3 carbons, so when CO2 is added, it will form a 4-carbon chain called oxaloacetate.
Another distinction between C3 and C4 pathways are the locations. The C3 pathway occurs exclusively in the mesophyll cells. In contrast, the C4 pathway occurs both in mesophyll cells and bundle sheath cells.
Carbon fixation of C4 plants occurs in the mesophyll cells. Then the 4-carbon chain, oxaloacetate, will travel to the bundle sheath cells to continue the Calvin cycle. It will release a carbon dioxide, then use ribisco to form 3-phosphoglycerate in order to initiate the Calvin cycle.
The change in location of the C4 pathway allows plants to grow in hot, dry habitats. Some examples of plants that undergo the C4 pathway are sugarcane and corn.
The other adaptation occurs in CAM plants. The CAM pathway is different from other pathways as it separates carbon fixation and the Calvin cycle by the time of day.
The CAM pathway is similar to the C4 pathway in the same sense that it utilizes a 4-carbon chain. The major distinction between the two pathways is the time of day in which it occurs. Carbon fixation of the C4 pathway can occur at any time of the day, but carbon fixation of the CAM pathway occurs exclusively at night.
CAM plants undergo carbon fixation at night and then undergo the Calvin cycle during the day. This allows them to minimize the effects of photorespiration, allowing them to live in hot, dry habitats. Some examples of CAM plants are pineapples and cacti.
So how do we feel about photosynthesis now?
Photosynthesis is so hot.